you'd be hard pressed, I think, to show this is actually God in some sense in Mark's gospel. He's never called God. He is called the Son of God. The Son of God can mean a variety of things. In the Old Testament, the Son of God is usually understood to be some kind of being, an angel or a human being, who has been assigned by God to a particular mission on earth. And so, for example, the King of Israel was called the Son of God in the Old Testament. And so being called the Son of God doesn't make somebody God. Certainly in Mark, Jesus is not equal with God the Father, and that is the later Arian view. But the ideas in Mark, I think, certainly did carry on, and there were Christian groups that continued to insist, not just like the Arians. I mean, the Arians, of course, thought Jesus was God in a sense, but it wasn't the full sense that the Nicene Creed opposed. There were people in early Christianity who had more of Mark's view, which Jesus was a very righteous human being who became the Son of God. And I think right after Jesus' death, some of his followers started thinking like this, because the second that they started saying Jesus was raised from the dead, they started thinking, well, we thought he was the Messiah before he died, and that didn't work out too well. But God raised him from, oh my God, he really is the Messiah. How can he be the Messiah? And so then they've got to figure out, well, maybe we had the wrong idea. Maybe God's Messiah isn't going to be a great king. Maybe he's going to be something else. Maybe he's going to be a divine figure. So then they had to explain that for that to happen, he had to be crucified. And so they came up with the whole theology of Christianity.
And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm joined by the legend, Dr. Bart Ehrman, with his new upcoming course about the Gospel of Mark. The links are in the description for the course. I'm definitely going to be there, like always, like all the other courses. I'm always there, especially with Dr. Bart. Now, this is a subject that I'm really interested in, because when it comes to Mark, a lot of people don't know that Mark comes first, and that there's a lot of things in the following Gospels that they don't agree with. So my first question for you is, what are some of the things that Mark tells us about Jesus that the later Gospels try to fix?
Yeah, it's a good question. And thank you for introducing me as a legend. I'm glad you didn't introduce me as a myth, because I do exist. Yeah, Mark, one of the points of my course is going to be that you have to read Mark just for what it has to say. You can't think or assume or believe that you shouldn't, that it's saying the same thing as Matthew or Luke or John. They all have their own distinctive message. And Mark's is interesting in part because Matthew and Luke copied Mark for part of their stories, and changed it in places, sometimes significantly. Some of the changes would be kind of subtle corrections to Mark, and some are kind of explicit. But one of the things I'll be emphasizing in my lectures is that the Gospel of Mark really wants to stress that during Jesus' lifetime, nobody could figure out who he was. He orders when he is recognized, when the demons are being cast out and they call out and they say, "You are the Holy One of God." He tells them to be silent, and he heals somebody and he'll say, "Don't tell anyone." And then he'll be transfigured in front of three of his disciples, and he'll say, "Yeah, don't let anyone know about this." And so he's like keeping it a secret, and nobody can figure it out. And so there's this business in Mark where he's trying to emphasize Jesus really was the Messiah. The Messiah really had to be crucified, contrary to what everybody thought, but nobody in his lifetime could figure that out. And man, you don't find that, especially in John, for example. In John chapter 1, people are saying, "Yeah, you're the Messiah." And so it's a very different portrayal that way.
That's interesting. Now, is there a difference because when we talk about the earlier Gospels, and then Christ becoming more and more as God himself as the time goes on. By the time you get to the Gospel of John, all of a sudden he's the Logos who was there in the beginning, and he's created everything. Now, Mark's divinity, how far can we go? We can say he's the Son of God. We can say he's the Messiah. What about him being God himself? What do you think about that in just Mark?
Yeah, it's you'd be hard pressed, I think, to show that Jesus is actually God in some sense in Mark's gospel. He's never called God. He is called the Son of God. The Son of God can mean a variety of things. In the Old Testament, the Son of God is usually understood to be some kind of being, an angel or a human being, who has been assigned by God to a particular mission on earth. And so, for example, the King of Israel is called the Son of God in the Old Testament. And so, being called the Son of God doesn't make somebody God.
Right.
But Jesus clearly has enormous powers, and he's been invested with authority that's not available to most people, to just about anybody in the Gospel of Mark. The authority to cast out demons, the authority to teach, the authority to heal, to forgive sins, and so he has this authority that's been given to him. He's declared to be the Son of God when he's baptized. That's when God says, "You are my Son, in whom I'm well pleased." And so the question is, if Jesus is divine in some sense in Mark, and the question is in what sense, and what did Mark really think? My view about this is you can't really get it from Mark. Mark himself doesn't tell you exactly what he's thinking. But it does appear, we do know of Christians in the early church who thought that when a person was taken, when Jesus was taken up to heaven at the end of his life, that's when he actually became a divine being, that he was a very righteous human being who was taken up and made a divine being. Mark may have that idea. He may have the idea that at the baptism he became the Son of God. It's hard to know, but he's not God in the sense that he created the universe. And there's no evidence, there's no reference to him pre-existing his life. There's no virgin birth, and so these things aren't there that they are in the other Gospels.
Interesting. It's almost like when you think of that early Christian group known as the Arians, who were duking it out with the church over how to define his divinity. Maybe you're almost left to wonder if Mark is one of the Gospels they're looking at and saying he's not exactly the same as the Father. He's sort of separate in his own way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting idea because certainly in Mark, Jesus is not equal with God the Father, and that is the later Arian view. When the Arians came along, one of the difficulties that they and their opponents had is that they all agreed that all the Gospels agree on everything. And so they weren't able to say, yeah, well, Mark doesn't have that view, because they all said, yeah, they all, it was right before you get evangelical Christianity in the modern world, you had this kind of parallel in the ancient world where all these texts are God speaking to you. And so, but the ideas in Mark, I think certainly did carry on. And there were Christian groups that continue to insist, not just like the Arians. I mean, the Arians, of course, thought Jesus was God in a sense, but it wasn't the full sense the Nicene Creed opposed, and so they didn't have that full sense that others had. Mark had there were people in early Christianity who had more of Mark's view, which is that Jesus was a very righteous human being who became the Son of God. And so Arians would be kind of a warmed up version of that, I guess.
Now, when you look at the earliest mentions of what the Messiah is supposed to be like, as far as like Jewish context, a lot of times Messiah is not the Messiah is a man chosen by God to usher in the kingdom of heaven and proclaim that God's coming. But they never actually say that the Messiah is God or the Son of God. How do you think Mark deals with this? Because Mark's coming up as one of these early Gospels. How do you think Mark deals with what the Messiah is supposed to be?
I think it's the big task that Mark sets for himself. I think that is actually what he's trying to do, is trying to show how it is that Jesus could be the Son of God, the Messiah. And the reason it's a reason that wouldn't make sense to most Christian readers right off the bat, but it would make sense if you put Mark in his historical context, where the term Messiah is a Jewish term, and Jews meant something by it, and they did not mean God. And they absolutely did not mean somebody who gets tortured to death by his enemies. So it's not the Messiah we know this from Jewish writings from the time, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know what Jews who thought about it, the Jews who did think about a Messiah, probably most didn't, but those who did think about the Messiah had various kinds of ways of trying to understand it. And the various ways had in common the idea that this was a powerful figure who would destroy God's enemies and establish Israel as a great kingdom and would rule that kingdom, a real kingdom here on earth. And so if many Jews thought he'd be like a son of David, who would be like a political military leader who would drive out the Romans and then set up his throne in Jerusalem and have Israel as a sovereign state again, like under King David. And so they had these expectations, various ways of doing it, but all of them had that. This is a figure of grandeur and power who's going to wipe out the enemy. And everybody knew that Jesus was somebody who got crucified by the Romans for crimes against the state. And so Mark begins his gospel in a very simple but subtle way. His first verse is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, or beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah. And anybody reading that who's not already a Christian will be saying, what? Jesus? the crucified crew? You're going to tell me he's the Messiah? Yeah, Mark's whole gospel is trying to show that it's not that Jesus got crucified despite the fact he was the Messiah. Jesus got crucified because he was the Messiah. And so Mark is trying to show that is what the Messiah is, according to the will of God as laid out in the Scriptures.
So that's interesting, because do you think it's safe to say that Mark is almost redefining what Messiah means?
What I would say is that the author is not, but the Christians before him who told their stories were. I think that it is absolutely a redefinition of the Messiah, and it was the major mission that the early Christians had. I think the early Christians were all Jews, and they knew some scriptures, and they knew the Jewish faith, and they knew what the Messiah was supposed to be, but they believed Jesus was the Messiah. They had to redefine it. What does it mean? And I think they were driven to that right away. I don't think, Mark is probably written about 40 years after Jesus' death. And I think right after Jesus' death, some of his followers started thinking like this, because the second that they started saying Jesus was raised from the dead, they started thinking, well, we thought he was the Messiah before he died, and that didn't work out too well. But God raised him from, oh my God, he really is the Messiah. How could he be the Messiah? And so then they've got to figure out, well, maybe we had the wrong idea. Maybe God's Messiah isn't going to be a great king. Maybe he's going to be something else. And maybe he's going to be a divine figure who's up in heaven, and so they, and so then they had to explain that for that to happen, he had to be crucified. And so they came up with the whole theology of Christianity. I think early. I don't think it was waited 40 years.
Now, how much does Mark draw from the Old Testament to paint the picture of Jesus? How much does he do it quite often?
He's not as explicit as some of the other Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew has 11 passages where he says that Jesus did something. He's born in Bethlehem, or he's born of a virgin, to fulfill what was spoken of by the prophet. And so Matthew 11 times is very explicit about it. Mark is usually more subtle than that, but it is striking that after he begins by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the very next thing he says is, as is spoken of in Isaiah the prophet. Then he actually quotes Exodus, Malachi, and Isaiah to show that John the Baptist was the one that Scripture had predicted would be Jesus' forerunner. And so it starts with a Scripture fulfillment thing. And Mark is just filled with the idea that all of this is going according to plan, that this is what God had in mind all along.
Why do you think Mark is coming at this with sort of a mystery feel? Like everything's so mysterious and secretive. What do you think the reason behind that is? Or do you think he's just being very creative with it?
Well, it's one of the things that makes Mark a great piece of literature that everybody misses because they just read it so quickly thinking it's like the others. It's like a short version, the Reader's Digest version. Okay, I guess I'll read that. So you don't really pay attention. But if you pay attention, as we said earlier, you find all of this stuff. And the question is why? Why do you find this? Why do you find Jesus keeping it secret? In Mark chapter 4, when Jesus tells his parables, boy, this is one people don't see. I ask my students, I have my students read Mark chapter 4, and I say, okay, why does Jesus tell parables? And they always say, well, he teaches in parables because he's trying to make a complicated lesson simple to understand. So he wants them to understand what he's saying. I said, okay, read verse 11 again. And so they read it, and it says that Jesus told parables so that nobody would understand. What? And so why does he do that? So the debate has gone back for over 100 years, where scholars are trying to figure out what they call Mark's Messianic secret. Why does he keep the Messiahship secret? And at the end, even the disciples never hear that Jesus was raised from the dead. Yeah. So there are lots of theories about it, but one view of it is that it is a mystical thing. I mean, this is not what you'd expect. God works in strange ways, and this is the latest strange way he's worked. Other people think that Mark is trying to show why it is that Christians today call Jesus the Messiah, even though during his lifetime, people weren't calling him the Messiah. Jesus was keeping it quiet. He's keeping it a secret. That's why. So it's an explanation of why, why this happened after his death instead of before.
And now, do you think this might have something to do with giving the women or portraying the women as the ones who figured this out and the disciples didn't figure it out? And maybe the idea of him cursing the fig tree, and the fig tree, they come back later and the fig tree's shriveled up. Is this the author of Mark saying that we're turning this thing on its head now? We're flipping the narrative, and no longer is this going to be some sort of movement that's just for people at the temple, but also it's for everybody, for the world.
Yeah, it's absolutely a flip of the narrative. And the cursing of the fig tree always puzzles people, but the fig tree in the Bible is often an image of Israel. And Jesus, it doesn't bear fruit, and so Jesus curses it, and it withers up. That seems to be a prediction of the destruction of the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And the women are the ones who find out. They go to the empty tomb. Jesus is definitely raised from the dead in Mark's gospel. And so he's raised from the dead, but the women are the ones who find out, and they never tell anybody. So Mark ends in a great note. The secrecy continues.
Wow, that was very incredible. So that's just barely the tip of the iceberg of what's going to be in this course. Link is in the description for the course. It's going to be about the Gospel of Mark, and you're definitely going to want to check this out. Also, by using my link, you're supporting my channel, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you for your time, Dr. Bart Ehrman, and we'll see you soon.
Great, thanks.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.